بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. I welcome you to a new class that we are doing here at MIC and it is about the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala, and in particular a book of his within the Sahih called Kitab.1, the book of Dua. And today's lecture will be all about who Imam al-Bukhari was and what was the methodology of his Sahih, and it will be like an introduction. It will be like an introduction to the life and times and the work of Imam al-Bukhari, and inshallah next Tuesday we will jump into the actual book, Kitab. So we begin very briefly. Obviously this is a brief overview. Otherwise Imam al-Bukhari's life and times and methodology is honestly the subject of many books and many dissertations, and much has been written in multi-volumes just about who was Imam al-Bukhari and his life and his methodology. So we will summarize all of this in around 45 minutes insha'Allah ta'ala. Who was al-Bukhari? Al-Bukhari, his name was Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ismail ibn Ibrahim ibn Mughira ibn Bardizbah al-Ju'fi mawlahum al-Bukhari. This is in your notes that you have. Abu Abdullah is of course his kunya. This is how names in early Islam were put. The first you put the kunya, Abu Abdullah. Who was his eldest son? He has a son by the name of Abdullah. He is Abu Abdullah. A kunya doesn't necessarily mean you have a son by that name. Abu Bakr's kunya, or Abu Bakr's name was Abu Bakr, and that was his proper name. And he didn't have a son called Bakr. And also Aisha had a kunya Abdullah, and obviously she did not have a son by the name of Abdullah. So having a kunya usually is something to do with your eldest son, but not necessarily. So I am Abu Ammar, and alhamdulillah I have Ammar. But just because a kunya has Abu something or something doesn't necessarily mean there is a son. However, we know that Imam al-Bukhari had children, and one of them was Abdullah. So Abu Abdullah. His actual name is Muhammad. His name is Muhammad, father's name Ismail, and grandfather's name Ibrahim. So very easy to memorize. Muhammad ibn Ismail ibn Ibrahim, and his great-grandfather Mughira was the one who converted to Islam. And Mughira converted to Islam during the lifetime of the Sahaba. The Sahaba, they conquered the province of Khurasan. And Khurasan is in modern Afghanistan and Iran. It is in a province that is modern day Iran and Afghanistan. So Bukhari is actually from the province of Bukhara, or in that land Mawara an-Nahar, which is in English is called Transoxania, and this is the land which is now in modern day Iran. So Bukhari was a Persian. Bukhari was a Persian, and he obviously had the features of a Persian, and he spoke Persian as his mother language. So the language he was fluent in was Persian, and Arabic of course he was fluent in, but it was an acquired language, and it was not the language he spoke basically at home. And his great-grandfather Mughira was the one who converted in the lifetime of the Sahaba. And in those days they had a custom which we no longer have in our times, and that is that they still viewed Islam as somehow having to do with tribalism, i.e. you had to have a tribe. Even if you didn't have one, some tribe would have to adopt you, right? And so if a non-Arab converted to Islam, all Arabs at the time had tribes, by the way, right? All Arabs at the time obviously had tribes. And by the way, remember our Seerah class, we're talking about Al-Arab al-Ariba wal-Arab al-Musta'riba. Remember the good old days, right? Not modern day Arabs. Many modern day Arabs don't go back lineage-wise to Qahtan and Adnan. Sorry, Arab brothers and sisters, but you know this is the fact, right? You are Musta'riba of a modern time, that the Arab civilizations came and made you Arab in your culture and your thaqafa and your language, but in your nisbah, a lot of the modern Arabs go back to the cultures and civilizations before Islam. So in those days, going back to the topic, if a non-Arab converted, they really viewed him as somehow you need to have a tribe. And how would a non-Arab get a tribe? He would adopt the tribe of the one who gave him da'wah, the one at whose hands he converted. And so the tribe of the person who gave da'wah to Mughira was Al-Ju'f. So he's Ju'fi. So the tribe is the tribe of Ju'fa. And Ju'fi means the one from Ju'fa, the tribe of Ju'fa. And because Bukhari was not really a Ju'fi by blood, they would say adopted by Ju'fa, or a client of Ju'fa. And in Arabic you say Al-Ju'fiyu mawlahum. He's mawla. And mawla means the tribe has adopted him. Blood-wise, he's not from the tribe of Ju'fa, right? Al-Ju'fiyu mawlahum. And of course, Mughira's father was Bardizbah, and Bardizbah was a Majusi, was a fire worshipper. He was a Zoroastrian, and he was a pure Farsi Iranian, and obviously he never heard of Islam, he never knew Islam. It was his son who accepted Islam. We don't know his lineage beyond Bardizbah. We don't know what is his lineage beyond Bardizbah. So Imam al-Bukhari had been a Muslim for 4 generations. Muhammad ibn Ismail ibn Ibrahim ibn Mughira, 4 generations of Islam. And before this, he was from a Zoroastrian family, and we don't know the lineage obviously of the Zoroastrian family. So Al-Ju'fi is not his tribe, it is the tribe of the one who gave da'wah to Mughira. So look at how long it lasted. 4 generations he kept on saying Al-Ju'fiyu mawlahum. And then eventually in the Abbasid time, this type of structure kind of collapsed, and in our times it is completely gone. Most Arabs don't even know if they even had a tribe or not. It's all gone now. That issue is now almost completely gone. And then Al-Bukhari, and Al-Bukhari means he was from the city of Bukhara. So we say Imam Al-Bukhari is not even his name. It is his nisbah. Where is his city? And in those days they would ascribe a person both to his blood and to his city. So his blood is Al-Ju'fi mawlahum, even though it's not his blood, metaphorically his blood. And his nisbah, where he's from, is Al-Bukhari, from the city of Bukhara. And this is his full and complete name. And Imam al-Bukhari was born in Shawwal in 194 Hijrah, in 194 of the Hijrah. And his father had been a businessman who dabbled in hadith. He's not a scholar of hadith, but he traveled for hadith and he traded merchandise at the same time. So he was from a middle class family, or you can say upper middle class family. And his father had the great honor and the privilege of studying with Imam Malik. So his father had sat at the foot of Imam Malik in Medina. Imam Malik, of course, he died in 179 Hijrah. So he died before Bukhari by 15 years, right? So Imam Bukhari's father had the luxury and had the honor of sitting with Imam Malik and with many other scholars of hadith, but he was not and he is not a famous narrator. In fact, he really has hardly any narrations in the 6 books. He's a minor, you can say he dabbled. And when Imam al-Bukhari was born, soon afterwards his father passed away. So Imam al-Bukhari never really lived with his father. He never really interacted with his father. However, we can assume that because his father dabbled in hadith, the son always wants to follow in the footsteps of the father. And he must have grown up hearing these legendary tales of his father going to Imam Malik, his father sitting with this scholar, with that scholar. So perhaps this was what inspired him at a very young age as an orphan to go and sit with the scholars of hadith, even though he's a little kid, 6, 7, 8 years old. And he's going to the big gatherings of the famous scholars of Bukhara. And books of history tell us that he corrected his teacher, the first sign that this kid is not a normal kid, he's way above his age, when Imam al-Bukhari was 11 years old. His teacher narrated a hadith and he made a mistake. And the way that hadith is narrated, you say, my sheikh told me, you mention his name, then his sheikh, then his sheikh. So you mention 3, 4 people. So in Imam al-Bukhari's time, his teacher would on average have 4 people between him and the Prophet ﷺ, right? 4 people. So his teacher mentioned somebody at a level that didn't make sense. So each narrator has a certain level. You have the level of the Sahaba, the level of the Tabi'un, the level of the Taba Tabi'un. You have different levels, right? And if you mention a Sahabi at the bottom, doesn't make sense. Or if you mention somebody in level 4, you mention him in level 2, we're talking about chronological levels, you understand? It doesn't make sense, right? So Imam al-Bukhari heard a name and he knew that this name doesn't fit in this chain because of the level. So without knowing the correct answer, because he didn't know the other alternative, he raised his hand and said, Shaykh, this is wrong. This name cannot come here. And in those days, it was considered to be insulting for a teacher to have notes like I have notes now. In those days, all teachers narrated from memory. And it was considered to be insulting that you're actually reading from a paper. You're supposed to be a teacher, you know everything up here, right? And so he doesn't have any notes in front of him. So the Shaykh got irritated and said, who do you think you are? I'm the teacher, who do you think you are? And Imam al-Bukhari insisted, said, no, Shaykh, can you please go back and check your written notes? So seeing the persistence of this young kid, the Shaykh actually went back into the house, checked his notes, and came back and marveled that indeed he had mixed up a name, and this name did not fit in this place. And this was the first sign that Imam al-Bukhari really had sha'an, or some bright future ahead of him. And he studied from all of the scholars in his area until by the time he was 14, 15, in his area of Bukhara, he had already taken all of the hadith. So you can say at the age of 14, 15, he already has maybe the equivalent of a master's. That khalas, he's done everything that needs to be done in his local city. At the age of 16, his mother and older brother went for Hajj. And by the way, his father had left them a good sum of money, enough for them to live a comfortable life. And this is of the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that even scholars have to live. And the fact of the matter is, most of our scholars, many of them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitated money from here and from there. Because one of the biggest problems of a student of knowledge is lack of resources. And I myself have gone through so many years in Medina, I can tell you, one of the biggest reasons why people drop out is because of personal. My dad needs to take me to take care of him. I don't have money to continue. Right? This is the human reality. And it is indeed a blessing from Allah that students of knowledge, they somehow get sustenance to put them through that period of their life where they're not earning. And Imam al-Bukhari, Allah had blessed him that his father left a decent inheritance. So he didn't need to worry about the rent and the food. And the same applies to many other scholars as well. For example, Imam Abu Hanifa was a rich merchant. His father again had left him. There are exceptions. Imam Ahmad lived a very tough life. Imam Ahmad lived a very tough life. But anyway, Imam al-Bukhari, middle class life because of the inheritance of his father. At the age of 16, his mother and older brother and him, they go for Hajj. And during that time, Hajj season and Mecca overall was the international university of Muslims. Because in those days, there is no 2-week visa, you have to go and come back. If you're going to go for Hajj and you're coming from Andalus, do you think you're going to sit there for 5 days? You might live there for 5 years. Because this is your one and only lifetime. It'll take you 2 years to go from Andalus to Mecca. You really think you're going to spend 2 weeks in Mecca? You're going to stay there months, years maybe even. Right? And what do you think the scholars are going to do when they're living in Mecca? They will benefit and narrate. And so Mecca was considered to be, for many centuries, the primary international Islamic university, where all the famous scholars in the world would be narrating fiqh and hadith and aqeedah and whatever else is going on. They're all having their halaqat. So Imam al-Bukhari, at the age of 16, he sees all of this. He is dazzled. This is a dream come true. And he begs his mother, you go back with my brother, let me stay here. He wasn't planning to do this when he left Bukhara, but now that he gets to Mecca, he sees what he wants to do. So his mother, with his blessings, with her blessings, allows him to remain in Mecca. And so he never returned permanently to Bukhara until the end of his life, as we shall study. He became a student of knowledge and a scholar, wandering from city to city at the age of 16. And he stayed in the Hijaz for over a decade. Hijaz meaning Mecca and Medina. And at the age of 18, he authored his first book. 18 years old, and he writes his first book. And this book, in now printed version, and I have it at home, it is in 9 thick volumes. This thick. Now what have we done at the age of 18? And Imam al-Bukhari writes a book which is one of the most advanced books or subjects possible, and that is Ilm al-Rijal, or the science of men. And the science of men, it deals with the biographies of all of the narrators of hadith. And so Imam al-Bukhari and the science of men is called Ilm al-Rijal, is the most difficult topic of hadith. Why? Can you imagine all of the names and their biographies and who did they study with and where did they travel to? You have to document all of this, right? And it is literally a biographical dictionary of thousands and thousands of people, from the Sahaba, Tabi'un, Tabi'un, Taba'ul Atba', all the way to the time of Imam al-Bukhari, and he compiled all of these names. And this book is now considered to be a standard reference for the science of Ilm al-Rijal. He wrote it when he was 18. To this day, scholars of hadith use this as a primary reference for figuring out the names, biographies, places. For Bukhari to have written this at the age of 18 shows us that he has mastered this field, and that the other fields of hadith are now basically already within his grasp, because this is the most advanced knowledge of hadith. And He wrote other books as well. Qadhi al-Sahaba. Qadhi al-Sahaba means the rulings of the Sahaba. What were the rulings of the Sahaba? And this shows us that his speciality is not just hadith, it is also fiqh. At the age of 18, he's writing about the fiqh of the Sahaba. What fatwas did the Sahaba give? That's not a book of hadith, it's a book of fiqh. And it shows us he has mastered more than one discipline, as we will come to. Of his greatest honors and privileges was he traveled to Baghdad. And in Baghdad at the time was the greatest scholar of hadith alive, and that is Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And so Bukhari studied with Imam Ahmad when he was barely in his 20s. And Imam Ahmad remarked a very poignant, a very powerful thing about Imam Ahmad is now in his 70s, 60, 70 years old. Bukhari is, 20s. Imam Ahmad said, I have never seen from the entire province of Khurasan someone like Muhammad ibn Ismail. Now Khurasan is one of the largest provinces of the empire at the time. And Imam Ahmad says, I have never met anybody from this entire province like Muhammad ibn Ismail. Scholars say, Imam Ahmad restricted himself to Khurasan because Bukhari is still in his 20s. Had he met Bukhari later on, then he wouldn't have to restrict himself only to Khurasan. So he's meeting Bukhari when Bukhari is still a young man. Imam Ahmad is the undisputed champion of hadith, and he is saying in the entire province, what is Khurasan? Khurasan is parts of Iraq, all of Iran, Afghanistan, this is all Khurasan, right? So he's saying in this entire province, I have not yet met anybody, scholar or student, the likes of Imam al-Bukhari. And we learn from the books of biography of Imam al-Bukhari that Imam al-Bukhari had what we now call a photographic memory. This is something we have now documented. It is now something science has proven. We know people who have photographic memories. Clearly, Imam al-Bukhari had photographic memory. That he only needed to see a hadith once, and he never needed the notes again. And Ibn Kathir writes, he would just read a page once, and that page would be memorized with him for as long as he lived. And this is something that in his own lifetime, people began to doubt, how is this possible? His memory was so amazing that in his own lifetime, scholars who were far senior to him began to say, these are rumors, these are legends, these are fairy tales. And on multiple times, scholars put him to the test in public and quizzed him in public. And by the way, just as a footnote here, so this issue of photographic memory, it is something that, as I said, you have many articles, documentaries, Google it on YouTube or something, you will find. I myself saw a documentary or a clip from 2020, the famous show 2020. There was a clip, and I saw this I think a year and a half ago. A very interesting thing that they said, that there is this phenomenon of the memory being so precise that there are a handful of people in the world that if you mention to them any day of their lives, 17th August 1963, he'll just close his eyes and he'll say, oh yes, it was a rainy day that day and I was working and this, and he'll tell you, and then you go look it up and you find that's the case. And you mention another date and you quiz him because you've asked his friends or relatives exactly what happened, and he will give you exactly. Or you look at the newspaper event, what was a major event that happened that day? Wallahi, me and you, we forget last Tuesday what happened, right? It's all a blur to us. But there are people, it's not as if they have to do it, they just have it, right? Now, are we surprised then that Allah Azza wa Jal blessed this ummah with people who had even sharper visions than these people of our times? And subhanAllah, these people who have such sharp memory, what do they use it for? They become the equivalent of circuses. They go around charging people to demonstrate, ask the questions of our audience, what's your name, what's your name, what's your name? Then they will regurgitate, your name is this, your name is this, your name is this. And they get money for this, right? That's what they use their memory for. SubhanAllah, is it unsurprising? Why are we surprised that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would bless the ummah with somebody who has even sharper memory and he uses it for hadith? And of the most famous tests done of Imam al-Bukhari was when he was in his 30s and he revisited Baghdad after Imam Ahmad passed away. He revisited Baghdad. Now his scholarship has now spread around the world. Everybody has heard of Bukhari. And wallahi, it's an amazing thing at the time for somebody in his 30s to have such a reputation. And the scholars of Baghdad said, this guy clearly, his followers have made him bigger than he is. So we will demonstrate once and for all that there's more hype to the man than really there is the man. What did they do? They told Imam al-Bukhari, let us all meet in the grand masjid of Baghdad. Baghdad has the famous masjid, the Masjid al-Jami' al-Kabir, the big masjid, and we will narrate 10 hadith, all of us, for our students to benefit from. And this was common at the time, that all scholars come together, you give 10, you give 10, you give 10, and they'll all take notes, and mashallah, tabarakallah, the students get the luxury of multiple, shaykhs giving multiple hadith. But they had tricked or they wanted to trick Bukhari. And what they wanted to do was to mix and match the chain of narrators called isnad with the matan, with the actual text, and to put the wrong matan with another isnad. So that outwardly it would appear that this hadith looks reasonable because A narrates from B, narrates from C, narrates from D, that the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. But the fact of the matter, A, B, C, D didn't narrate إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Rather, E, F, G, H narrated إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. You see what I'm saying here? Is that the isnad cut, the matan cut and pasted together, and you concoct a new hadith. Now, for the scholars of hadith, they don't just look at إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. They look at the chain going back. And if the chain is different, guess what? This is called a different hadith. For us, miskeen, us basic people, we just care about إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. We don't care about the chains. For the scholars of hadith, if there's a different chain, it's considered a different hadith. So, each one of the 10 mixed and matched all of their 10. And the first of them began, Bukhari sitting there, and he quotes the first hadith. And it's, for the student's perspective, a famous hadith. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Let's say, we don't know the actual 100, but it's a famous hadith. All the students have heard إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. So he mentions the first hadith, a different isnad. Then he asked Bukhari, do you have this hadith? Imam Bukhari says, no, I never heard this hadith. Now for the students, this is the most obvious hadith in the world. Bukhari is saying he's never heard it. The second hadith, again Bukhari says, I've never heard this. The third, the fourth, all 10, and these basic students know all 10. And Bukhari is saying, I've never heard these 10. Then the next 10 begins with the next shaykh. Then the next 10, until finally all 100 have been done, and Bukhari has admitted he is jahil for all 100 of them. So clearly they believe they have won now. Right? Because by the way, if Bukhari had said he has heard of them, they would have exposed him. These hadith don't exist. You made a mistake. Right? At least he's saying he's not heard of them, but now he really looks like a jahil, that he hasn't heard anything. Then when they're finished, Bukhari has said, are you guys done? They said yes. So he said, okay, as for you, back to the first one. Your first hadith was A, B, C, D, E, F, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. It is incorrect. It should be E, F, G, H, I, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. And then he began with the second, and he corrected. Then the third, and he corrected. All the way till he regurgitated 100 incorrect hadith, and he corrected every single one of them. Ibn Hajar, the famous commentator of Bukhari, who died 852, so many centuries after Bukhari, Ibn Hajar said, what is amazing is not that Imam al-Bukhari knew the right hadith. We would expect this from a hadith master. We would expect it. That he knows it's not A, B, C, D, E, it's rather E, F, G, H, I. We expect this. What is amazing is that he memorized the incorrect versions and the order that they appeared after having only listened to them once. And this is a live test done in the entire masjid of Baghdad with all of the thousands of students there, that Imam al-Bukhari's memory was tested, and these scholars clearly realized the hype is true and the man truly meets up that hype. And from this, Imam al-Bukhari, obviously it is not surprising that he continued the tradition of the earlier generations by never using a book in front of him. He never once quoted his Sahih from a manuscript in front of him. It was always from his memory. And he would sit in front of his students and start dictating. And they would just write from memory. And he would dictate the correct order of Sahih Bukhari with the chapter headings, with the minor commentary he might have, all of this from memory. And he did this multiple times in his life. And Imam al-Bukhari, obviously his morals and akhlaq are, obviously we expect them to be very high nature. He said he never once backbited anybody as soon as he learned that ghiba is haram. He never once backbited any person. And he used to finish the Quran every 3 days. So along with hadith, it's not as if he's ignoring Quran. Every 3 days he would finish the Quran. And there are many things narrated about him. Again, time does not permit us to mention too much, but there are many things that are narrated. Of the most interesting ones is that it is narrated that towards the end of his life, Imam al-Bukhari was going on a journey to make a purchase, some business transactions. Obviously, Bukhari had to dabble a little bit in business, and so he went on a ship to go to a land, we don't know to purchase what, but he had with him a good amount of money, 10,000 dinars. 10,000 gold coins is probably like maybe $250,000. That's a lot of money, like 10,000 gold coins. He had them, and he's on a ship, and the ship is a long journey. In the process of the ship, he befriends somebody, and it turns out this somebody was of a low character, evil character. And Imam Bukhari just happens to have a conversation with him and says, yes, I have 10,000 dinars, I'm going to buy such and such thing, whatever it might be. The next day, news spreads that the captain of the ship is saying, somebody has stolen 10,000 dinars from this companion of Bukhari. And we will search the whole ship to see who has 10,000 dinars. You understand what he's done? He's flipped it around now. And the guy is saying, somebody stole my 10,000 dinars. Now, even if they had found the 10,000 dinars, eventually Bukhari's name would have been exonerated, because simple. Bukhari can tell you the characteristic of the dinars. Bukhari can tell you things. The man hasn't seen the money, but he's just attempting to get this big money, perhaps far-fetched chance, right? Maybe he might get it. So when Bukhari hears this, he takes the bag of gold coins, puts it in his sleeve, goes to the top of the ship, and then when nobody's looking, throws it into the water. The captain searches top to bottom, nothing is found. Later on, the man comes and says, I know you weren't lying, you're Imam al-Bukhari, you must have had the money. Where's the hiding place? Now the plot has been exposed. Imam al-Bukhari casually told him, I threw it overseas, just threw it overboard. The man said, what? Are you a fool? Even if I wasn't able to get it and I lost, at least you could have benefited. Now neither of us benefits. So what did Imam al-Bukhari say? He said, I have spent a lifetime making sure that my credibility is clean, so that the ahadith of the Prophet will be accepted from me. And this is worth much more than 10,000 dinars. That can go, but my reputation cannot be tarnished, or else the hadith that I'm narrating will be tarnished. So he gave up a fortune just so that possibly a question mark might not come, that where did the 10,000 go? We don't know the real story. So Imam al-Bukhari simply got rid of it just so that his image is not tarnished. And Imam al-Bukhari, of course, there are other stories mentioned about him as well that really demonstrate his ikhlas, his sincerity. Imam al-Bukhari, one of the most important things about him, out of all of the famous scholars of hadith, Imam al-Bukhari was a master of two other fields. Generally speaking, a scholar of Islam is only a master of one field. Now this is something that many people do not understand. They think every alim is an alim of everything. And this is a big mistake. And I can explain to you in a way that most of you from Memphis understand, right? Most of you are doctors here, mashallah, tabarakallah. And you all know that a person who's specializing in one field, give me one example. Give me one example. Heart specialist, right? Is not going to know too much about, give me another example, cancer? Is that fair? Right? So when you understand this, that you have a generic knowledge of other specialities, not, I cannot give a heart specialist a radiology test to go and analyze. That's not his field. He's never really done anything like this, except back in his residency when he was 22 years old. Otherwise, it's all forgotten now, right? So us non-doctors, we might not understand, you're a doctor, aren't you? Why can't you analyze this? Then you will say, I'm a doctor of this. Wallahi, Islamic specialization is even more broad than the specialization of medicine. And the scholar who specializes in hadith might not know fiqh very well, because hadith is an entire discipline. And the scholar who specializes in theology might not know tafsir very well, because that's a whole different ballpark. Literally, it is like the humanities, sociology, anthropology, history. Can you expect the master of anthropology to know history that well? No. So it's very rare in the history of the ummah that you find a scholar who is truly a master of multiple fields. Very rare. Yes, you can be good in multiple fields, but a master, this is very rare. And Imam al-Bukhari was one of those. He was a specialist, obviously, of hadith, and he was also a specialist of aqeedah, theology. And he was also a specialist of fiqh. And he wrote books in hadith, and he wrote big books on aqidah, theology, and he wrote books on fiqh. And his Sahih demonstrates his speciality in these three fields. And none of the other scholars of hadith, Sahih, Imam Muslim, Imam Tirmidhi, Imam Nasa'i, none of them really rival Bukhari in this comprehensiveness. That Bukhari was a master of these multiple fields. And he has books on Aqidah. His most famous book of Aqidah is called Khalqu Af'al al-Ibad. It is printed, it is available. The fact that Allah creates man's actions. So he refuted those who denied Qadr. He's affirming Qadr. Allah creates our actions. He's affirming Qadr. And he has other books as well. In terms of fiqh, many of the scholars of the madhahib, they wanted to acquire Bukhari. The Hanbali said he's Hanbali, the Shafi'i said he's Shafi'i, the Maliki said he's Maliki. But the reality is that he was independent. He had reached a level of ijtihad. He was not a muqallid to the great Imams, even though he studied under Imam Ahmad and he studied under the students of Imam Malik and the students of Shafi'i, but he was not a muqallid. He was basically his own fiqh, if you like. And he studied hadith from over 1,000 teachers. And the most famous of them was Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and also other famous scholars that every student of hadith knows, Ali ibn al-Madini, Ishaq ibn Rahway, and Yahya ibn Ma'in. These are some of the more famous scholars that he studied with. His students, he taught Sahih al-Bukhari to over 90,000 students, And it is enough of an honor for him to look at his roster of students. You tell a sheikh sometimes just by looking at his students. For example, Ibn Taymiyyah. Of his students is Ibn al-Qayyim. Of his students is al-Dhahabi. Of his students is Ibn Kathir. Of his students is Ibn Rajab. This entire generation is called Madrasa of Ibn Taymiyyah. One sheikh, but he inspires so many people. Look at the students of Bukhari. The students of Bukhari, number one, Imam Muslim. Imam Muslim, the guy who wrote the next Sahih. He was a student of Bukhari, as we will study. At-Tirmidhi, the one who wrote the other Jami' at-Tirmidhi, is his student. An-Nasa'i, who wrote Sunan, is also his student. So, out of the famous 6 books, you know the famous 6 books of hadith, 4 of them revolve around Bukhari and his students. 4 of them revolve around Bukhari and his students. Right? Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i. As for Abu Dawood, his main teacher is Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So because of this, Abu Dawud has a different, if you like, he's directly going to Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And Ibn Majah, there was a time and there was a place difference, so Ibn Majah did not benefit that much from Imam al-Bukhari. And he had other famous students as well that are known to the advanced students of hadith, Abu Hatim al-Razi, Abu Bakr ibn Abi Dunya. These are all of his students. And that is why so many scholars praised Imam al-Bukhari. And of the greatest praise that was given, Imam Ahmad said, I have never seen anybody from Khurasan, the likes of Imam al-Bukhari. And once Imam Muslim came up to him in public, in a public gathering, and Imam Muslim kissed him on his forehead. And he said, دعني أقبل رجليك يا أستاذ الأستاذين يا أستاذ الأستاذين ويا شيخ المحدثين ويا طبيب الحديث في علله. Allow me to kiss your feet. This is not justice just to kiss your forehead. Of course, he's just saying this. He's not going to bow down and kiss his feet. Allow me to kiss your feet. دعني أقبل رجليك يا أستاذ الأستاذين. O teacher of teachers. ويا شيخ المحدثين. And you are the sheikh of all muhaddithin. And O doctor of hadith, طبيب الحديث في علله, in its hidden defects. And ilal, the hidden defects, is the most difficult chapter of analyzing a hadith. And he's saying, Imam al-Bukhari, you are the PhD, the doctor. You are the analyst of the defects of hadith. This testimony is coming from the second most famous scholar of hadith in the world, as Imam Muslim. And Imam Muslim is saying, Bukhari is not one notch above me. Bukhari is light years ahead of me. Bukhari is light years ahead of me. And Imam al-Bukhari wrote probably around 21 books. Unfortunately, quite a few of them have been lost. We don't have, at least as far as we know, every once in a while some major discovery is made in some manuscript collection or in some bookshelf somewhere in the world of a hidden copy. Allah knows if it's going to happen. But we have around half a dozen books of Bukhari in print, and his most famous book obviously is his Sahih, which we'll talk about in a while. His second most famous book is Al-Adab Al-Mufrad. And this is a one-volume book, Al-Adab al-Mufrad, and it translates as the separate book of manners. Al-Adab, Adab. Al-Mufrad, the separate book. Why the separate? Because he has the book of Adab in his Sahih. The Sahih al-Bukhari has a book called the Book of Adab. So he wanted to write a bigger book separate from his Sahih, so he called it the separate book of Adab, Kitab al-Adab al-Mufrad. And it is a thick one-volume book all about adab. How do you treat your parents? When do you say salam? Who says salam to whom? How do you eat? The book of adab, manners. And a very dear friend of mine, Ustad Abu Isa Ni'matullah, has done a very thorough, extensive commentary of Al-Adab al-Mufrad, and it is available on DVD. It's a very detailed commentary of Al-Adab al-Mufrad. The book also has been translated and is available in the marketplace. And he has written other books as well. Of his most important books is the Tarikh al-Kabir we talked about. He also has Tarikh al-Saghir and Tarikh al-Awsat, which is different books of men, the different books of biographies. And as we said, at least half a dozen of these books have been in print. The death of Bukhari was a bit of a tragedy in that towards the end of his life, people became jealous of him, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tested him with some trials. And this is something that many people find surprising, and it is something that is a sad reality of human nature, that even scholars have their petty jealousies. You see, all of you in your fields, you have your jealousies. Doctors are competing with one another, right? Professors, teachers, your own company, everybody's cutthroat competition. This is human nature. You all know this from your own occupations and background. Many of you don't realize that scholars are also human. And the sad reality, sometimes shaitan gets the better of some people, and they think that their criticism of another scholar is meant for Islam, whereas it is meant for their own ego, right? And sometimes it is possible that the one who criticizes might be somehow sincere, but shaitan makes a small issue much bigger, right? And he feels that, oh, who does this guy think he is and whatnot. And this is what happened with Imam al-Bukhari's contemporaries and Imam al-Bukhari. That Imam al-Bukhari got so famous that his contemporaries, some of them, they really could not fathom, or they could not swallow it. And of his most famous problems was with the Sheikh of Bukhara, his own hometown. Towards the end of Bukhari's life, when he was around 59 years old, 58 years old, Imam al-Bukhari decided to now finally retire back to his hometown. Not retire from hadith, but retire back to his hometown. And so Imam al-Bukhari announced that he's moving back to Bukhara. And he moved back to the city, or the province that he came from. And the most famous scholar of hadith in the area was somebody by the name of Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhali. Al-Dhuhali. That was the most famous scholar. And to give you an idea of who he was, Al-Dhuhali was the mentor of Imam Muslim. Okay? So before Bukhari comes back, Imam Muslim is a student. Who's his teacher? Al-Dhuhali. So Bukhari comes back, and Imam al-Dhuhali is so excited and ecstatic, he actually leads a procession welcoming Bukhari back and saying, we are so happy you wanted to retire, we're grateful for you to come back, the city is all yours. However, after a short period of time, when Bukhari started teaching, al-Dhuhali noticed his students diminishing and Bukhari's students increasing. And he lost his most prized student, Imam Muslim. Imam Muslim, when he studied with Bukhari, he realized Imam al-Bukhari is light years ahead of Imam al-Dhuhali. And so he wanted to benefit. So he started attending the halaqat of Imam al-Bukhari, and Imam al-Dhuhali's halaqah grew smaller and smaller and smaller, and Bukhari's halaqah grew bigger and bigger and bigger. And during that time, there was a controversy that we don't have time to get into about the issue of the Quran being created or uncreated, a very famous controversy that happened. And the Sunni position is the Quran is Kalamullah, created or uncreated? Uncreated. This is the Sunni position. This is what defines Sunnism. The Quran is uncreated. And Sunnis unanimously agree the Quran is uncreated. Kalamullahi ghayru makhluq. And anybody who says the Quran is created for Sunnis, this was an innovation, a bid'ah, a mubtadi'. Somebody who says is a mubtadi'. Now, what happened was, to make a long story short, somebody asked an ambiguous question to Bukhari. And these questions are a little bit vague. When I recite the Quran, is my recitation created or not? This is a question that is like splitting hairs, right? You're going too deep. We believe the Quran is uncreated. But now, when I recite the Quran, so what am I reciting? The Kalamullah. But then my voice, is my voice, so you're asking too many questions, right? And that's why, asking too many questions sometimes is a problem, as the Quran tells us. Going too deep, right? Tell us about the cow. What color is the cow? Where did the cow come from? You know the story, the Baqarah, right? Asking too many questions can backlash. So somebody, Allah knows who he was or what his niyyah was, begins asking Bukhari these deep questions until finally Bukhari answers, when you recite the Quran, your voice is created. Now pause here, footnote, because I mentioned the topic. So Imam al-Bukhari was ahead of his time, and he went beyond what his scholars were comfortable saying, because at the time the position was, let's not talk about the voice. Let's just leave that Quran kalamullah ghayru makhluq. Let's not get into the voice, is it created, is it uncreated. Bukhari was ahead of his time in that he analyzed this issue that previous scholars didn't want to talk about. And he said, when you recite the Quran, there is an element that is uncreated, and that is kalamullah ghayru makhluq. But the medium of expression, which is your lungs and the air and the vocal cords, this is created. And similarly with the Mus'haf, the Quran. Somebody says, is the Quran Mus'haf created or uncreated? This is an ambiguous question. The pen that the Mus'haf was written by is created. The ink is created. The paper is created. The book is created. But what is written on the paper is uncreated. What the ink has written is uncreated. What is in the book is uncreated. You see the point here, right? There's an element of ambiguity, and Bukhari was ahead of his time. So he said something that no scholar before him had said, which is, there's a clarification. When you say the voice of the Qadhi is created, so the voice is created, but what he recites is uncreated. Let me clarify this with a simple example. To be or not to be, that is the question. Who said that? I just said it. You see? You see? You see the point here? When I say, who said that? All of you said Shakespeare. But you just heard it from my voice. Well, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى, to Allah belongs the even more perfect example. This is what Bukhari was saying. That when a Qari recites the Quran, there is an element, not kalam al-makhluq, not Shakespeare's kalam, Allah's kalam, uncreated kalam. And then there's an element that the voice, the lungs, the vocal cord. So Bukhari was ahead of his time. Okay, this came back to al-Dhuhali. And may Allah forgive him and us. And all of us have our personal faults, and perhaps he was sincere. Allah knows, perhaps shaitan made it different, pleasing to him, and inshallah Allah Azza wa Jalla is forgiving. So he jumped on it and he said, Bukhari is claiming the Quran is created. And Al-Dhuhali was the sheikh of the town. The children have grown up with him being the mufti, right? He has the prestige. Bukhari, no matter he's from Bukhara, but he's a foreigner now, because he hasn't lived in Bukhara. Right? No matter what his prestige is in the city, he is somebody coming in as a stranger now. And so there was a big commotion, because our shaykh, whom we trust and we've grown up knowing, is saying that Bukhari is a mubtadi', because he's saying something that we've never heard before, and that is the voice of the Qari is created. So Al-Dhuhali said, abandon Bukhari, leave Bukhari alone. He is an innovator. He believes in a heretical belief. And Imam al-Bukhari, obviously, this was very painful for him, because he has kept his reputation crystal clear. And his reputation in theology is stellar. And by the way, it was because of this controversy that he wrote one of his last books ever, and that is called خَلْقُ أَفْعَالِ الْعِبَادِ, that Allah has created the actions of men. And his point was, the actions of men are created by Allah. So, the voice is created, but what is recited, the Quran is uncreated. Right? So this is what the book was about. Nonetheless, this was very painful for him. Coupled with this was a political problem that took place. So this was a religious problem, coupled with, at the same time, a political problem took place. What is the political problem? The political problem was that the governor of Bukhara, and the governor, in those days, the Muslim empire was divided into provinces, and the province itself becomes hereditary, mini kingdoms. So whoever is the governor, his son's going to be the next quote-unquote governor, and they have pretty much autonomous rule. It is as if they're mini kings, but they don't call themselves khalifas, right? And they give a tax to the khalifa, and the governance is basically up to this governing family. So the governor of Bukhara, so in all effects, he's like a mini king. The governor of Bukhara is happy that Bukhari comes back. He sends a messenger to Bukhari's halaqah. And the messenger says, the governor is asking that you come to the palace and that you teach Sahih al-Bukhari to his sons. So Imam al-Bukhari responds back, I have a halaqah here, and the sons of the Amir can come and study with the rest of the people. The emissary comes back. The governor is saying his sons require a private halaqah, not a public. My sons are not going to come and mix with the people. They're princes, they're royalty. You have to go to the palace. Imam al-Bukhari said, go tell the Amir this knowledge is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and anybody is able to take it, but I will not sell my knowledge to the highest bidder. Knowledge is open, anybody can come. And so back and forth, and the tone is getting more and more blunt, and Bukhari is refusing to compromise on this, that he's not going to give a private audience to the princes and leave the people. He's not going to do that, because he's not interested in the fame or the fortune. And the rumors began to spread that the governor was so incensed and angry that how dare Bukhari refuse my command and my money and my offers, and however much I offered him, he's saying no. How dare he refuse? Rumors began to spread that he would exile Bukhari, that if this is your attitude, then don't live in my province, go somewhere else. And this is at the same time happening with the religious controversy. And subhanAllah, it is the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that no matter how blessed a person is, there are trials that Allah blesses that person with, no matter how honorable. And it is through those trials that a man's status is raised. While these fitnas are happening, Bukhari feels isolated. Bukhari feels alone. But in our times, we don't even know the names of his opponents and the governors. I mean, of course we do with the books of history, but the masses, I'm saying, who knows? The name of al-Dhuhali is forgotten, except as the one who was an opponent of Bukhari. May Allah have mercy on him and us. And the name of the governor, the only thing he's known for was his harshness for the Bukhari. Look, subhanAllah. Whereas at the time, it appeared that the honor and the izzah belonged to the other camp. Right? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala works in ways that are beyond our understanding. And so Bukhari, on the night of Eid al-Fitr in 256 Hijrah, memorize this date, the death date of Bukhari, 256. And the night of Eid al-Fitr, now can you imagine the night of Eid al-Fitr means what? The situation was so tense that the last day of Ramadan, he just broke his fast, and he must have been planning this for a number of months. He decided to now pack his bags and leave. And so on the night of Eid al-Fitr, he basically packed his bags and he's leaving Bukhara, and he makes a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he says, oh Allah, this earth, despite its vastness, has become tight for me. This earth, despite its vastness, it has become tight for me. So if you feel it better, then take my soul now, rather than living a difficult life and whatnot. And Bukhari himself knew, because it is in his Sahih, and we will study this in Kitab al-Da'awat, we will study this very hadith, and he knows this hadith because he compiled it, that the Prophet ﷺ said, none of you should wish for death because of a calamity that has befallen him. However, if he must do so, then let him say, oh Allah, allow me to live as long as life is good for me, and allow me to die when death is better for me. And this is the dua that Bukhari made. So he knows what he's making dua for. So the situation was so bad for him at this time that he basically made this dua, that oh Allah, if everything is now khalas, I mean, I'd rather go on a good note and you take me now, rather than live a difficult life, if if death is better for me. And he barely uttered those words, and he was with his family walking out of the city, and he died within the city of his birth. And to this day there is a big mausoleum, even though ironically he himself did not agree with mausoleums, but and because in Sahih Bukhari there is the chapter of graves and you're not supposed to build on graves, nonetheless later cultures have done this, and in our times there is a massive mausoleum on the grave of Imam al-Bukhari, and Imam al-Bukhari's grave is in the city of Bukhara where he was born. So memorize the date 256 is Bukhari. طيب. The next section, his Sahih. For the next 15 minutes we'll talk about his Sahih and then open the floor for questions. Okay, the Sahih al-Bukhari. The Sahih al-Bukhari. It is very important to understand the name that Imam al-Bukhari gave to his Sahih. Because when you understand his name, you will understand his methodology. The name of Imam al-Bukhari's book, it has two versions in the manuscripts. And the first version is the version of Ibn Salah. Ibn Salah said Imam al-Bukhari called his book Al-Jami' Al-Musnad Al-Sahih Al-Mukhtasar min Umuri Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wa sunanihi wa ayyamihi. Each one of these terms is important. Ibn Hajar has a very similar title, Al-Jami' Al-Sahih Al-Musnad min Hadithi Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sunani wa ayyamihi. So the main difference is the word Mukhtasar occurs in Ibn Salah, and in Ibn Hajar it says Hadithi Rasulullah, and Ibn Salah it says Umuri Rasulullah, similar things. Otherwise it is pretty much the same. So let's go over each one of these words so that we understand what was Bukhari's goal. Number one, Al-Jami'. Al-Jami' means the comprehensive collection. So Bukhari is saying, I want to write a book that is comprehensive for all of the sciences of Islam. This is not just a book of Islamic law. This is not just a book of Islamic theology. It's not just a book of tafsir. It's not just a book of seerah. This is Al-Jami'. So Al-Jami' means comprehensive. And we will see that no author ever came close to Imam al-Bukhari's comprehensiveness. He has in it chapters that no other scholar of hadith was able to include. He has in it interpretation of dreams. He has in it the chapter of hopes and aspirations, Kitab Tamanni, meaning I call this the first psychological self-help book ever written in the history of man. Imam al-Bukhari is saying, what should you aim for? Kitab al-Tamanni. What are your, in order to tamannayat? What should you hope for? Kitab al-Tamanni. He has in there. He has in it the book of history, the book of the previous prophets, the book of the beginning of creation, the book of the blessings of the Ansar, the book of the blessings of the Muhajirun, the book of the Maghazi of the Prophet ﷺ. He has in it all of the famous books of fiqh that we will think of, Tahara, Salah, the timings of Salah, the Janazah, all of the fiqh we can imagine, it's in there, right? He has in it the book of softening the heart. So all of these books, and he has in it the book we will study, the book of Da'awat, the book of Dua, right? So we find that Bukhari truly was a jami'. And the meaning of jami', comprehensive. And before Imam al-Bukhari, nobody had ever written a jami'. Nobody had ever written a jami'. Imam al-Bukhari was the first scholar to write a book, jami'. Before Imam al-Bukhari, there were two types of books. The first was like the semi-hadith and fiqh, which is the Muwatta Imam Malik type. And the second was just compile every hadith you find, which is the Musnad Imam Ahmad. Musnad Imam Ahmad. Musnad Imam Ahmad is that massive collection, 45,000 ahadith. And it is massive. It is literally in the modern day print, which is the print by Sheikh Shu'aib al-Arnaut, the editor. It is literally larger than this table. Literally. Larger than this table, spanning all of this Imam Ahmad's Musnad. But its arrangement is not according to topic. Its arrangement is just everything. All of the hadith of all of the Sahaba just put together. So Imam al-Bukhari wanted to write a comprehensive book in chapter headings. This is Al-Jami'. Number two, it says Al-Musnad. Let's follow Ibn Salah's wording. Al-Musnad. Al-Musnad means Imam al-Bukhari is saying, I will give you the source, the reference, the isnad for every hadith. Al-Musnad. Al-Musnad means with isnad. With isnad means A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So-and-so narrated, that so-and-so narrated, that so-and-so narrated, that so-and-so narrated. So this is the isnad. So he is telling you, I am giving you the full details that you need. Al-Musnad. And so this is not a book that you just have, for example, all of the books that most of you are familiar with, Riyadus Salihin, 40 Hadith of Nawawi, these are not Musnad. They just give you the Hadith. Correct? Mishkat al-Masabih, they just give you the Hadith. These are not original books with Isnad. Whereas Bukhari is saying, mine is a source book with Isnad. You know exactly where I got it from. The third, As-Sahih. And As-Sahih obviously means the highest level of Hadith. Hadith is many levels. Sahih, Hasan, Da'if, Da'if Jiddan, Mawdu'. These are the 5 main levels. Memorize them. Go over them again. Sahih, Hasan, Da'if, Da'if Jiddan, and Mawdu'. These are the 5 main categories of hadith. Under each of these categories, there are subcategories beyond the scope of this class. So Sahih is grade A. Hasan is grade B. Da'if is like a C minus. We're really not sure if the Prophet said it or not, right? Da'if D is D. Da'if D, right? Da'if Jiddan is like a D minus. And then fabricated F, Mawdu'. Fabricated is F, Mawdu'. We know for sure the Prophet didn't say it, right? And so Bukhari's level of hadith is grade A plus, that's it. He never goes down to B plus. And Bukhari was the first person ever to write a book of Sahih. So Bukhari was unique in 2 ways. Nobody before him preceded him. Number 1, writing a jami'. Nobody before him wrote a jami'. And number 2, writing a Sahih. Nobody before him wrote a Sahih. So, Al-Jami', Al-Musnad, Al-Sahih, Al-Mukhtasar. Al-Mukhtasar means what? Summarized. Now, the first word is Al-Jami'. The fourth word is Al-Mukhtasar. Isn't this a contradiction? How can you have Jami' and Mukhtasar? The response, no, there's no contradiction. Al-Jami' in its scope, Al-Mukhtasar in its content. Al-Jami' in the topics. I'm going to talk about everything you need to know about Islam. But Al-Mukhtasar, I don't plan to record every Sahih Hadith in the world. And this is a very important addition because it shows us that Imam al-Bukhari never intended to include all of the Sahih Hadith of the whole world. This is a common misconception the average Muslim has. If it's not in Bukhari, it's not Sahih. And this is, no scholar ever says this. If it's not in Bukhari or Muslim, it's not authentic. No scholar ever says this, only a jahil says this. Bukhari himself told you it's mukhtasar. I don't plan to compile all the Sahih Hadith or else my book would be 10 times larger than it is. So Al-Jami', Al-Musnad, Al-Sahih, Al-Mukhtasar, min hadith Rasulullah, min umuri Rasulullah wa sunni wa ayami, from the life and times and actions of the Prophet from the sayings of the Prophet and his days. So he is saying, it's not just what the Prophet said, it's also what happened in his lifetime, what he did, what happened during his lifetime. All of this will be discussed in my book. So this is the longer title, and we just called it Sahih al-Bukhari. He called it Al-Jami' al-Musnad al-Sahih al-Mukhtasar min umuri Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wa sunanihi wa ayyamihi. Where did he get the idea to compile it? So 2 stories are mentioned, and both of these add together, and they are both show us his idea. The first, he tells us of a story that he had as a young man. The story that he had as a young man. And he tells us that when he was a young man, he saw in his dream the Prophet ﷺ, and Bukhari was standing in front of the Prophet ﷺ, and there were flies coming. And Imam al-Bukhari was standing there warding off the flies, protecting the Prophet ﷺ from these flies. When he woke up, he asked his shaykh what this dream meant. And the shaykh said, you will ward off fabricated hadith from the Prophet ﷺ like these flies basically. Your job in life is to protect the Prophet ﷺ from these pesky flies that are trying to come to him but have nothing to do with him. And this is hadith falsely ascribed. These are fabricated hadith. So Imam al-Bukhari got the idea of basically specializing in hadith. And then as for the idea of actually writing Sahih al-Bukhari, this came to him from his famous teacher Ishaq ibn Rahweh. Ishaq ibn Rahweh, another famous Persian scholar of hadith and one of the giants of hadith of his time, that once Ishaq ibn Rahweh was teaching his students, Bukhari was his primary student, and he happened to mention that it would be such a good idea if somebody wrote a book concentrating only on the Sahih Hadith. So Imam al-Bukhari said, that idea entered my heart as a young student, and I retained it until I was able to do it. And this also shows us that one of the characteristics of geniuses, and Ishaq ibn Rahawayh was a genius, that they have lots of amazing ideas and they have great students. So the genius just keeps on giving ideas, and subhanAllah, another genius takes the idea and runs with it. And that's what happened with Bukhari and his teacher Ishaq ibn Rahawayh. So this was his idea, to write a book of only Sahih Hadith, and it took him a total of 16 years to write it. And he compiled it primarily in the city of Basra, where he lived for 5 years, and he performed Hajj every year, and he's sifting through over 600,000 hadith that he had memorized. 600,000. He is sifting through and trying to find those ahadith that fit the match the most perfectly to write his Sahih. Then during the last few years of writing the Sahih, he moved to Medina because he wanted to have the blessings of living in Medina. And especially in the last year of those 16 years, he spent his entire time going over and re-editing and revising. So his entire day and night is dedicated for Sahih al-Bukhari. And he told his students later on that for every single hadith that I chose, I made special wudu and I prayed 2 raka'ah istikhara in the rawdah of the Prophet ﷺ for every single hadith. So there's a spiritual element here as well, right? Now can you imagine how many wudus and how many raka'at and how many times you would have turned the hadith away? So as it is, there are over, as we'll study, 7,200 ahadith in Bukhari. How many he would have turned away? So 10,000 ahadith, basically, just say roughly, how many raka'at and how many wudu he is doing. Just a special spiritual blessing that he wants to make sure this is a perfect book to present to the people. And Imam al-Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala, he chose some conditions that were truly stringent, very strict. And that is why Bukhari is universally acknowledged as being the most authentic book ever written by man. Now, in order to understand and appreciate how perfect Bukhari is, this really requires an understanding of hadith, and that's a little bit beyond the scope of this seminar that I'm giving. But I'll just give you one or two things about this Imam al-Bukhari's perfect way of doing this. So the biggest issue of hadith comes that in a chain of 4 or 5 people, on average, Bukhari has 5 people between him and the Prophet. By the way, memorize that. On average, Bukhari has 5 people. And he has over 100 hadith where he has 4 people. And he has 21 hadith where he has 3 people. And this is the highest chain for Bukhari. 21 hadith, there's only 3 people between him and the Prophet ﷺ. These are called thulathiyat, the 3 hadith or the 3 narrators of Bukhari. Otherwise, the average chain has 5. Some have 6, but the average is 5. So the problem comes that imagine 5 people. Imagine one batch of students, then another batch, then another batch, then another batch. You have 5 batches of students. Every batch has its A's, B's, C's, D's, E's, and F's, correct? Every one of you who has taught a class knows this, right? The problem comes when you have a chain of 5, it is almost impossible to get narrators that are A in every single level continuously linked together. You will get an A and then a B and then AAC like this. You will get a A plus student, A plus, then one person is a B minus, right? Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala, wanted only A grade material. He didn't want anybody who was above average, which is a B student. He didn't want a B narrator of hadith. He did not want anybody who was a good narrator. He wanted only the cream of the crop. Literally A grade students. And if you understand a little bit about, doing the permutations here, you really understand how impossible this is, right? And that's why Ishaq ibn Rahawayh, his teacher, and Imam Ahmad and others, they kind of sort of never attempted this project. Because it's truly a daunting project to try to make sure that every hadith is grade A. And no one in anybody who wrote books of hadith was more careful than Bukhari. This is well known to all the specialists of hadith. Even Imam Muslim had to go down to B and sometimes even C types of narrators once in a while. He even went down to C narrators. As for the other books, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, you even have lower than this sometimes. But Bukhari, not a single narrator in his entire Sahih al-Bukhari was somebody who was da'if. And that is why, now all of you know that my undergraduate specialization was in hadith studies. The specialization that I have is hadith studies before I went into Aqidah. And so in the College of Medina, which alhamdulillah I'm very proud and humble to say that it is acknowledged, perhaps I'm being biased towards my alma mater, but it is acknowledged that the College of Hadith at the University of Medina is the strongest specialized college at the undergraduate level in the Muslim world. It's a very well-known thing because hadith itself is a rare speciality, and alhamdulillah in Medina we really had a very solid and strong program. And in the College of Hadith, I studied Sahih Bukhari the first year completely. That was, we did the Sahih Bukhari, second year we did Sahih Muslim, then third and fourth year we split up Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, half years each. So we did Bukhari the entire year. And I will never forget, that we had a very famous teacher for Sahih Bukhari, and he told us that at our level, as specialists of hadith, now when I say specialists, not at the graduate level, but still undergraduate hadith is a specialization in of itself. He basically said to us that, look, if the narrator that you're looking up, if Imam al-Bukhari mentioned him in his Sahih, then at your level you don't need to do any more research. Bukhari has done the job for you. Now I want you to understand that what our Shaykh is basically saying is that if Bukhari has done the research, khalas, you guys at your level, at the undergraduate level, you really have no need to do anything else. It's understood that this man is a trustworthy man, that you cannot do anything more now. And this is being said 12 centuries after Bukhari lived and died. Now, no doubt, if you are a master of hadith and whatnot, then you have the right to disagree with whatnot. But at our level, we're basically told, just follow Bukhari. Because he's done the job, people have attempted to find faults and whatnot, you're not going to find anything. And this is from my own experiences, little that I had, this is obviously very true. Also, one of the things that Bukhari insisted on, which was no other scholar of hadith ever insisted on, is something that is truly bizarre. Now, I have to explain to you a little bit about how the sciences of hadith work. Generally speaking, when a person whom we trust says that so-and-so narrated to me, and we know that so-and-so lived at a time frame when this person could have heard him, we assume that he heard him directly. Without asking, did you travel to him? Did he travel to you? Where did you meet? We don't ask any questions. We assume that the average honest Muslim, when he says so-and-so said, an fulan, that he must have heard it from so-and-so. Let me give you an example that helps clarify the point. So, in my younger years, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed me to live at the same time as three giants of our religion. Shaykh al-Albani rahimahullah ta'ala, Shaykh ibn Baz rahimahullah ta'ala, Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah ta'ala. Three major famous scholars that I admire and I respect and I look up to. If I were to say to you, Shaykh al-Albani said, and Shaykh ibn Baz said, and Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen said, and I quote all three of them, and imagine this is a hadith, you should assume that because I lived at the same era as them, I must have heard and met Shaykh al-Albani and Shaykh ibn Baz and Shaykh Uthaymeen. Is that clear? Right? This is the assumption that all scholars of hadith live upon. Why? Because can you imagine trying to figure out each one of the biographies, who met whom, when, in which gathering? Wallahi, this is impossible, except for Bukhari, as we're going to come to. This is impossible. However, you would not know unless I told you that I did not have the honor of ever meeting Shaykh al-Albani rahimahullah ta'ala. Yes, there was a live teleconference once. He spoke to us directly, but that's a teleconference. Before Skype was invented, there's a good old phone, right? I never met him. I never traveled to Jordan. Our brother here, mashallah, met him, but I never met Shaykh al-Albani. You do not know that I, alhamdulillah, had the pleasure to meet Shaykh bin Baz many times and had iftar with him at his house and sat at his feet literally, alhamdulillah, sat at his feet literally and held the microphone up to his mouth for quite a while between him and Shaykh Suhaib Hassan translating. I had the honor of meeting him, but I never really was able to study with him. Just halaqat. You would not know that, alhamdulillah, had the honor to study with Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen for a whole summer. The summer before he passed away, I lived in Unayza, or I moved to Unayza for that summer, and I lived there and I studied with Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen. You would not know that. To you it's all the same, because all three of them, I was able to meet them. Unless I told you or else other people told you, this would be unknown to you. Are you guys following this point, right? Imam al-Bukhari said, I insist on knowing who studied from whom. And this is a condition that is so difficult to meet that even Imam Muslim, in his introduction to the Sahih, he criticizes this position as being extreme. His own student, Imam Muslim, says some people, he couldn't mention his teacher by name because it's too much of an honor. Some people had the extreme condition that they made it mandatory that every student must have known to have met the teacher. And if we were to do this, then we can't really compile hadith. Muslim did not have this condition. But the only human being to ever live up to this condition was Bukhari. That he made it a necessary requirement that every single student, we know for a fact that he met the teacher in front of him. And it is because of this, I just gave you two reasons, there are many more than this, that Imam al-Bukhari truly is head and shoulders, is light years ahead of every other Sahih book. And it is universally acknowledged by all the specialists of hadith that Imam al-Bukhari's Sahih is the most authentic book ever written in hadith sciences. There's nothing more authentic than this. Even though one can say that Sahih Muslim, its arrangement is easier, and it is easier for the lay Muslim to understand. But in terms of authenticity, Imam al-Bukhari is way ahead of Muslim. And in terms of user-friendliness, Imam Muslim is easier to digest. And this shows us as well another point, that Imam al-Bukhari was truly a genius. And when genius is right, it's difficult for the layperson to unravel and unpack. For example, we also see this with Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim. Ibn Taymiyyah, when he writes, amongst the Muslim masses, Ibn al-Qayyim is more popular than Ibn Taymiyyah. And if you go to any bookstore, Ibn al-Qayyim's books are selling more than Ibn Taymiyyah's. Why? Because Ibn Taymiyyah, when he writes, it's intellectual. It's deep, it's dense. Ibn al-Qayyim, he's writing for the masses. And Ibn al-Qayyim, truly, he's a simplifier of Ibn Taymiyyah's thought for the masses. We find the same thing with Bukhari and Muslim. That Bukhari, it's a different level. And Muslim, he's simplifying it for the masses. Some things that we need to know before we actually begin next week, some things we need to know. And this will benefit us, inshallah, anytime we read Sahih Bukhari, and especially when we begin our discussion next week, inshallah, with the Kitab al-Da'awat, or the book of dua. One of the most important maxims to memorize, Fiqh al-Bukhari fi tarajumihi. This is the famous maxim every student of hadith memorizes. It translates as, the fiqh of al-Bukhari is in his chapter headings. By fiqh, we don't mean legal fiqh. By fiqh, we mean understanding of the hadith. By fiqh, we mean the understanding of the hadith. Imam al-Bukhari, he gave you his commentary in the chapter heading. So the chapter heading should never be rushed. You actually need to digest and unpack the chapter heading before you move on to the hadith. And a lot of times, the beginning student will not even be able to understand the relationship between the chapter heading and the hadith. It requires a little bit of unpacking. So, fiqh al-Bukhari fi tarajumihi, the understanding of Bukhari is in his chapter headings. He will give you a commentary. Bukhari did not comment on the hadith. What is his commentary? The chapter headings before the hadith. Also, a very important point of Imam al-Bukhari is that Imam al-Bukhari, of his methodology, is he uses a hadith and statements of the Sahaba sometimes within the chapter headings. Within the chapter headings. And these ahadith sometimes don't have any isnad. And these are called the hanging hadith. In Arabic, al-mu'allaqat. The hanging, because they're suspended. Why is this important? Because sometimes Bukhari needed to quote an authentic hadith that was grade B, but not Sahih. It's Hasan. And he doesn't want to include it in his Sahih because it's not Sahih. But he needs it for some reason. So he puts it in the chapter heading without an isnad. So you know that this is not Sahih. And therefore, it's very important for the one who studies Bukhari that when he comes across a hadith that is in the chapter heading, he should never say, narrated by Bukhari in his Sahih. This is a big mistake. Rather you say, reported in mu'allaq form by Bukhari in his Sahih. You never say narrated because it's not the same as his actual hadith. And we'll give you examples in Kitab al-Da'awat. I'll give you examples. So this is called mu'allaqat. Also, one of the important things to mention, and I already mentioned this before, is that Al-Bukhari never intended to write all of the Sahih Hadith. So for example, we're going to study Kitab al-Da'awat, the book of Da'awat. Don't think that there are no more authentic Hadith of du'as. Rather, there's lots of them. But we're studying the most authentic book ever written of du'as. And Imam al-Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala, what he did was he divided his Sahih into many books. And this is confusing for the beginning reader. Sahih al-Bukhari is actually composed of 97 books. Now, what I mean by this is Imam al-Bukhari intended for every book to be what we call a chapter. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, Chapter 4. And in those days they didn't have chapter. So he said Kitab, Kitabul Ilm, Kitab, Kitabul Nikah, Kitab al-Tahara, Kitab Awqat Mawaqit al-Salah, right? Kitab this and that. So whatever the Kitab, Kitab al-Istidhan, Kitab al-Jihad, Kitab al-Da'awat, he has different kitabs. And the Kitab here literally means Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3. And different printings of Bukhari have different chapters, not because there are different versions of Bukhari, but because sometimes some students mixed or merged two chapters into one. So they would just write two chapters, they put it into one. For example, the book of marriage and divorce. And some would say the book of marriage and then the book of divorce. So because of this, there are differences in printing and manuscripts. And most printings have 97 books. Most printings have 97 books. And those printings that have 97 books, the book that we will do is number 80. Kitab al-Da'awat, the book of dua. Right? The book of invocations. Kitab al-Da'awat. And how many ahadith are in Bukhari? Well, there are many opinions about this issue, once again, because sometimes two hadith is counted as one hadith counted as two. And Ibn Hajar, rahimahullah ta'ala, and others, they have done a thorough commentary and a thorough analysis. And Ibn Hajar has said that there are around 7,563 hadith in Bukhari with repetition. With repetition. And there are 2,602 connected hadith without repetition. 159 of them are mu'allaqat hadith, i.e. without an isnad. For a grand total, you add 2,602 with 159, for a grand total of 2,761 non-repetitive hadith. This shows us that on average, Bukhari repeated a hadith how many times? On average, roughly? 3 times on average. 3 times. And a very interesting, that's on average. Sometimes he repeated hadith 10 times. Sometimes he never repeated the hadith again. Now this is different. The biggest difference between Bukhari and Muslim, there are many differences. The biggest difference, Muslim never repeats. All repetitions are in the same area. He'll say hadith number A, and there's a version A1, there's a version A2, there's a version A3. You're not going to find A1, A2, A3 anywhere else in his book. That's why I'm saying it's user-friendly. Bukhari, on the other hand, he will literally have 10 versions of A scattered throughout all of Sahih al-Bukhari. And what's truly amazing, generally speaking, every single version will be different from another version, with a different isnad and a different wording that suits the chapter that he wants to use the hadith for. He repeats the same hadith in multiple chapters so that he's trying to extract as many benefits as he can from that one hadith. So he'll put it in one chapter, another chapter, each time extracting another benefit. And when I teach Sahih Bukhari in my class that I do, more extensive than this one, I actually demonstrate this by going over a number of examples, and I go over one famous hadith 10 different times, 10 different places, 10 different wordings, 10 different isnads, and 10 different benefits that he extracts from the exact same hadith. And so this is something you do need to keep in mind. And with this, inshallah ta'ala, we will pause this week, and inshallah next week we'll begin Kitab al-Da'awat. And just FYI, so inshallah, Brother Rusli, is he here? We'll be printing the Kitab al-Da'awat, and those who need a copy, you can purchase it at cost form, because it's going to be big. You have the summarized version. We're not doing the summarized version, we're doing the original version. So whoever has the original Bukhari, yes, obviously the original is longer, obviously, that's why it's summarized. You're a doctor, right? Yeah, just kidding you. Okay, I had to bring something back in. So whoever has the original, you can bring your book. If you have original Sahih Bukhari, you can bring your book. Whoever doesn't, so inshallah, we hope that by next week we'll have an idea of how many people. It's going to be, it's over 100 hadith. So it's going to be a bit of a packet. So obviously, that's going to be whatever is the photocopying cost or whatever. You can purchase it, inshallah ta'ala, next week. Are there any questions about Bukhari or the Sahih? Yes?
You said that Bukhara is in Khurasan. But as I know, it's in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. Is this the same one?
Yes, you are correct that in modern day it is in Uzbekistan. You are correct. It is in Uzbekistan. In those days, Iran was the larger province, and yes, in modern day it is in Uzbekistan. You're absolutely correct. Yes.
You mentioned towards the end that you would repeat and have the same hadith, but if it had a different matan and different isnad, why would it not be considered a separate hadith?
So the question is, if it's a different isnad, isn't it a different hadith? The response is yes, from Imam al-Bukhari's and the muhaddithin perspective, it is a different hadith. But for us average lay people, we see pretty much the same matan, little bit difference here and there. So for us, we consider it to be one hadith. But in reality, it is a different hadith. Yes. Yes.
Is mutawatir a layman categorization?
So there are over 50 different categorizations of hadith, and this is the subject called the science of hadith, mustalah al-hadith. And mutawatir is one type of hadith. And mutawatir means a hadith that has been narrated by so many people at every single level of the chain that it is impossible for it to be fabricated or weak. And there are mutawatir hadith, people have compiled mutawatir hadith in various books, and the mutawatir hadith are not that many in number, perhaps only a few hundred are mutawatir. So mutawatir is the highest level of sahih. But there are many sahih hadith that are not mutawatir. The most famous is إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. This is ahad hadith. This is singular hadith. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ is not mutawatir. So just because a hadith is not mutawatir doesn't mean it is not sahih. Any sisters would have any questions? I cannot see any hands raised. If you want to write your question or speak out loud, that's fine. No question from the sisters. Back to the brothers. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Dr. Zaman. Yes. So the question is, what was the position of Imam Muslim with what happened with Imam al-Bukhari? Imam Muslim was so angry with Imam al-Dhuhali that he went home and collected all of the notes he had ever studied with Imam al-Dhuhali and put them on a donkey and sent it back to Imam al-Dhuhali's house and said, take it back. Because he was so angry at Imam al-Dhuhali. Now, notice, even in this, Bukhari tops Muslim. So, in the time when Bukhari and Dhuhali were friends before the fitna began, so Imam Bukhari heard a hadith from Imam Dhuhali that he didn't have this chain. Despite what happened, Bukhari, writing his last books, actually quoted a hadith from Imam Dhuhali. And he narrated from Imam Dhuhali, even though Imam Dhuhali had done what he had done. Because he knew, and listen to this, brothers and sisters, subhanAllah, it's amazing, that Imam al-Dhuhali's animosity was personal, and that his ahadith were still absolutely correct. Who amongst us can reach that level, that Imam al-Dhuhali's legacy was preserved? This is not in Sahih al-Bukhari, in other books of Bukhari, right? That Imam Bukhari narrated a hadith from Dhuhali, that he didn't have this particular chain, he liked this chain, and so to this day we have a hadith, one hadith only, that he didn't have in this particular higher level, so he narrated it through Dhuhali. Whereas Muslim, in his Sahih Muslim, he doesn't have a single hadith from Dhuhali, even though his main teacher for 15 years was a Dhuhali. But he got so angry at the treatment that Bukhari had that he said, Khalas, take it all back. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
The books I have, they're arranged in volumes. How does that relate to chapters?
The volumes simply have to do with printing. How much material can you get in one printing? So that has nothing to do with the chapter headings. That has nothing to do with chapter headings. You look up the table of contents at the end of the book and find the book Kitab. It's not called Kitab al-Du'a, by the way. It's in the plural, Kitab al-Da'awat. The book of invocations, the book of du'as, whatever it is. And if you have that entire book, then you can bring that next week and you can use that. And by the way, obviously, I will not be commenting on isnads of Bukhari. That is too advanced for this class. When we studied Sahih Bukhari in University of Medina, obviously we went over every single name of every single narrator. And we had to memorize every single narrator's basic biography and, when did he die and what is his full name. If it said Ishaq, we had to know, is it Ishaq ibn Rahway or Ishaq ibn Uyayna, which is how. That's obviously, don't worry, we will be skipping the whole isnad. I will just jump straight to the hadith and just do the hadith. And we have limited time. We're going to have to do around 15 hadith every session, which means this is not an advanced commentary. This is going to be an intermediate commentary. And this I have to make the disclaimer for those who want that. Yes?
So different scholars refer to Sahih Bukhari or Bukhari. So there is a difference between Sahih.
No. If you say Bukhari said or Sahih Bukhari, you are referencing one book. But technically, Imam al-Bukhari wrote 21 books. But al-Bukhari Sahih is so famous and so much above the other books that when you say, even when a scholar says, reported by Bukhari, he doesn't need to mention which of those 21 books. Because it's understood that there's one book that shines above the rest, and that is Sahih al-Bukhari. Okay? Yes, go ahead.
So, did he ever read the last narrators in his chain?
All of the last narrators of the chain are his teachers, obviously. That's the whole point. All of the last narrators, that's his teachers. That's where he's hearing it from. Yes?
When we say, you or somebody narrate a hadith, when you say mutfaqun alayh, meaning it's Bukhari and Muslim?
So the term muttafaqun alayh means it is narrated by both Bukhari and Muslim. And this is another type of Sahih hadith. And it is given a special honor because both Bukhari and Muslim agreed to narrate it. This is muttafaqun alayh. Okay. Sisters, yes, go ahead.
What happens to his children?
So the general rule in Islamic history, the children of scholars don't become scholars. This is the general rule. Rare are the exceptions. Rare are the exceptions. And even when they do, they are not anywhere to the caliber of their parents. So, as far as we know, none of Bukhari's children became a hadith specialist. If you look at even the other scholars of hadith and whatnot, only Imam Ahmad, his son Abdullah, kind of specialized in fiqh and hadith, but nowhere to the level. And Abu Dawood, his son Sulaiman, he was also a minor, if you like, dabbled in hadith, but none of them competed with their fathers. And I have my own personal theories for this. And also this is even the reality. Look at the major scholars of our times. SubhanAllah, their children, generally speaking, they're not inspired, to do this. And Allah knows. I have my own theories, but Allah knows, inshallah. With that, inshallah, we will conclude for today. And inshallah, tomorrow is the seerah. And then next Tuesday, we'll resume Kitab al-Da'awat, inshallah. Bismillah.